Hello and welcome to this presentation on risk management tools. And for this presentation, I'll be teaching the assumptions and constraints analysis tool. What is assumptions and constraints analysis? It's a risk identification tool which identifies risk by testing the assumptions and constraints, if they can be false, and what the impact to the project is if they are. The purpose is to explore the validity of assumptions and constraints in order to determine which pose risk to the project. Assumptions would expose risk to the project or threats if false. Constraints would expose opportunities potentially if false. So we want to see which ones we can exploit, take advantage of. When is assumptions and constraints analysis used? Since it's a risk identification tool, assumptions and constraints analysis is used in the identify risk phase of the project. But it's also not only applicable at the beginning of the project, but also anytime there's a change in the project environment. Anytime new assumptions enter the project, according to Pritchard, the assumptions and constraints analysis is an appropriate tool to reuse to test the validity of those new assumptions and constraints. It's in the identify risk phase that the project manager seeks to identify individual project risks as well as overall project risk and document their characteristics. And assumptions and constraints analysis is a useful tool for accomplishing that purpose. In order to accurately use the tool, we need to identify and define our terms. So we start with an assumption. What is an assumption? It's things in the project that the team thinks to be true but are not guaranteed about the project. And they can be related to anything impacting the project. Human resources, budget, schedule. You can have assumptions about weather conditions, assumptions about procurement of resources, etc. Anything that touches the project that you assume to be true but is not guaranteed to be true is an assumption. And assumptions can be made as to events that may occur and how the project will respond if occurs. And assumptions are usually defined and recorded at the beginning of the project. But again, anytime the project changes, new assumptions could enter into the project as the project continues. What is a constraint? A constraint is any limit that's placed on the project. Like assumptions, it can be related to any aspect of the project. So a project budget would be a constraint, must be under this amount of money. A project schedule is a constraint, must be finished by this date, etc. Anything that limits the project in any way is a constraint. And constraints can interact with each other and must be prioritized. So the assessments and constraints analysis is a pretty straightforward process. It's basically a three-step process. Step one is we've got to list our assumptions and constraints for the project. Those can be brought in from already documented project documentation, or we could list new constraints or assumptions that have come up at this point in the project. Once the assumptions and constraints for the project are listed, step two is to test those assumptions and constraints. And we do that by asking two questions of each assumption and each constraint. One, could the assumption or constraint be false? In other words, is this thing that we're assuming to be true, or this constraint that we know to be true, could it eventually be false? And if it were false, would one or more project objectives be affected, either positively or negatively? In other words, if we miss this schedule constraint, for example, how would that positively or negatively affect the project? If this assumption that we're making about the weather proves not to be true, how does that affect the project, either positively or negatively? And then step three, if the answer to both questions is yes, in other words, yes, it could be false, and yes, if it was false, it will affect the project, then we need to generate a risk. And the form of the risk that's generated takes the form of this assumption or constraint could prove false, leading to an effect. And we'll demonstrate that here in a moment. So how does this work and how are they documented? Well, step one, again, is to list assumptions and constraints for the project. And what I've done here is list just a few constraints and assumptions that I've made for my swim lane cruise software, hardware, and electrical project. I've listed two of each. The first two are assumptions. Assumption number one is there will be good weather in the Cape Cod area. Assumption number two, labor and resources will be readily available on time and in sufficient quantity. The next two are constraints. The project will be completed no later than June 1st, 2019. That's a constraint. And the total cost of the project will be no more than $32 million. That is also a constraint. So we've listed all of our assumptions and constraints, and now step two is we need to test those assumptions and constraints. again, the two questions are documented in our spreadsheet. And this spreadsheet is just a handy way to document our work as we're continuing through assumptions and constraints analysis. But question 1, could this assumption or constraint prove false? And for all of these, I've said yes. Yes, there could be bad weather in the Cape Cod area. That would then be false. That assumption of good weather would be false. Labor and resources may not be readily available on time and in sufficient quantity. The project may not be completed by June 1st, or before it could be completed before June 1st, and the total cost of the project could be less than or greater than $32 million. So for all of these, they could be false. And then the next question is, if they're false, would it affect the project? And again, this could be affecting it positively or negatively. If there's bad weather, will that affect the project? Yes, it could affect the project. It could cause schedule delays, for example. If labor and resources were not readily available on time and in sufficient quality, would that affect the project? Yes, it would. That also could cause cost overruns and schedule delays. If the project is completed earlier than June 1st, 2019, would that affect the project? Absolutely. There's an opportunity there for some schedule savings, but there's also the potential that it's completed later. That would also affect the project. And the total cost of the project will be no more than $32 million. If it's under $32 million, does that affect the project? If it's over $32 million, obviously that does affect the project. So there's a couple of opportunities that we can identify and a couple of threats to the project also from validating these particular assumptions and constraints. And so then step 3 is, if the answer to both questions is yes, generate a risk. And here I've just generated some example risks. These may not be the best risks, but they're just examples. Good weather in the Cape Cod area could prove false, leading to a delay in the project schedule. Labor and resources may not be readily available on time and in sufficient quantity, resulting in cost overrun and schedule delays. The project being completed no later than June 1st, 2019 could prove false, leading to an opportunity to finish early. And there I worded it as an opportunity since this is a constraint and I'm looking at it in terms of can we finish early. And I did the same with the cost as well. So that's basically the technique of assumptions and constraints analysis. Again, very straightforward, very simple. It's just taking each assumption and each constraint and testing it with those two questions. Could it be false? And if it's false, how does it affect the project, either positively or negatively? So having said that, what are the strengths of the assumptions and constraints analysis tool or process? One is it's a simple process. As you see, it's taking all the assumptions and constraints, testing them with those two questions, and then generating a risk. Very simple. It can be based on assumptions and constraints that are already documented in the project charter. Again, no new work needs to be generated for this process. It can be done using already generated assumptions and constraints that have been documented earlier in the project. 3, it generates project-specific risks, which is the goal of the identify risks phase of the project. It's also a low resource requirement approach because you don't need a lot of money or people or time. It's, again, very simple and straightforward. It helps to prioritize key constraints and maximize value, but it also aids in quantitative analysis of assumptions. What are some of the weaknesses of the assumptions and constraints analysis? And I've identified 3. 1 is it can have an extremely limited utility if the assumptions analysis is done for its own sake and documentation is not generated regularly. In other words, if it's just for the sake of the assumptions themselves but not for generating risk, then it can offer low utility if risks are not generated and documented on a regular basis as they need to be as the project continues. 2, hidden constraints or assumptions are often missed. If assumptions or constraints are not made explicit, they can't be tested. So any hidden assumptions that haven't been considered, or constraints that haven't been considered are not going to be adequately tested or validated by this tool, and therefore won't provide value for generating risk. And thirdly, and related to the second one really, is that the tool or this process is only as good as the assumptions and constraints. In other words, if your assumptions and constraints are inaccurate, poorly worded, ambiguous, hard to understand, then the process of validating them is not going to be effective and you won't generate effective risks using this tool. So in summary and by way of conclusion, assumptions and constraints analysis is a risk identification tool that validates the assumptions and constraints for the project and assesses the effect they can have on the project if false. It's a technique that's only as effective as the quality of the assumptions and constraints, but it's a simple technique. It uses few resources and it's based on documented assumptions and constraints. Thank you very much for your time and attention. Please consider the references at the right for further information about assumptions and constraints analysis.